I am very, very happy to be here. Some of you may know this, but Singapore is almost the Bikman family's second home, where one of our daughters was born at Mount Alvernia Hospital 15 years ago, many years ago, when I used to work at Duke NUS. And so then we came back here in 2016, we came back in 2018, and finally we are back. And tonight, right now, while Daddy is working, Mommy and our son are out at raffles, and then my two daughters are shopping on Orchard Road. So I need to make more money. I cannot afford shopping in Singapore. Okay, I am so happy to be here. One of the reasons I love Singapore so much was because of my time at Duke NUS. Why did Duke NUS want American scientists, and indeed scientists from all over, to come and work and study diabetes? It's because there is a unique diabetes problem in East and Southeast Asia. That's some of what I want you to understand today, and then understand how you may have some solution to this problem. Okay, so just to help us understand the scope or how big the problem is, most adults, over half of adults globally are overweight. They have too much fat. So here's the fat cells, too much fat on their bodies. Now what is so important is to understand that not all bodies are going to have the same problems with fat. You can have a big, chubby Caucasian who is really, really fat, and then an East Asian, Singaporean, for example, who's just a little chubby, and that might be more problem than this, and I'll talk about that later. But there is a lot of extra body fat in people all around the world, and over half of all adults have a problem called insulin resistance. And CK mentioned in my introduction, thank you again, that I study insulin resistance. That's one of the main focuses of my research career, and indeed the focus of part of my talk tomorrow at NUS. Now, in addition to being very common or prevalent, insulin resistance is very relevant because it contributes to some of the most chronic, expensive, and even scary diseases. Scary diseases like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, scary diseases like certain types of cancers. These all have a common core, namely insulin resistance. This is why I feel it's so important, because rather than looking at them as unrelated diseases, we should look at them as all branches growing off of the same tree. And when we understand that, we can just cut down the tree. Okay, now, the focus of my talk is to help you understand how body fat connects to insulin resistance, because there's a very interesting connection. And then we will talk about how to help solve that problem. The human body is capable of getting fat or fatter in two different ways. On one hand, you can have someone who is gaining fat mass because their fat cells are all getting bigger and bigger. That is a process called hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is when the number of fat cells is not changing, but the person's gained 10 kilos of fat because the fat cells are getting bigger. However, on the other hand, there can be someone who's gaining the same 10 kilos of fat, but it's because they're making more fat cells. Now, in this case, there are more fat cells to carry the metabolic burden, if you will, and so there are more fat cells, but they're smaller. This method of gaining fat, hypertrophy, when the fat cells are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, is unhealthy. And it directly contributes to insulin resistance and then all of the problems that come with insulin resistance. This is a form of insulin resistance that I call, when I teach this to my students at my university, in fact, on my way here to Singapore, I missed one of my lectures at my university. And the lecture that my TA, my teaching assistant, taught for me was this idea of how fat cells contribute to metabolic disorders. And when I teach this concept, I sometimes talk about fast insulin resistance or slow insulin resistance. This is slow insulin resistance. when the fat cells get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it starts promoting or spreading insulin resistance around the body. Now, let's ask the question, but Professor Ben, does this matter in Singapore? Yes, it matters in Singapore. And to help you understand this or to appreciate this, I want to just highlight some of the differences between the US and Singapore when looking at obesity and diabetes rates. So in the United States, people love to just joke about how fat all the Americans are. And yes, the United States has high rates of obesity. But there are many countries that are much fatter than the US, just for the record. Just so you know. But also people say, oh, the US has really, really high rates of diabetes. Yeah, it's not good. But in Singapore, there's something very interesting because obesity rates are very low. But diabetes rates, how does diabetes in Singapore compare to diabetes in the US? In fact, this one's a little old now, but it's still the same sort of difference, which is if you zoom in on the most diabetic countries on the planet, every time you look, Singapore has higher rates than the US does. And yet we're the fat ones in the US. We're so big and chubby. And in Singapore, no. It may be sometimes, but for the most part, people are much, much leaner than you see in the average white European American. But that's because of how the different bodies store fat differently. So there are two things that are very important. And remember, when CK introduced me, he said, pay attention. I am hoping that, my hope as your professor right now is that you are thinking, how can I take what Ben is saying and then share this information with a friend? So part of what I hope you will share with your friend is, hey, did you know that we have worse diabetes rates in Singapore than in the US? And they will say, no, that's crazy. And you can say, no, I heard it from a diabetes scientist who worked at Duke NUS and is giving a talk at NUS Med School. He knows what he's talking about. This is the only thing I know about. I don't know anything about anything else. But there are two things that are very important because of this. When you start looking at what is unique in Singapore, there's more fat in the middle of the body, and then there's more fat in the liver because of this. Now, why does this type of fat matter? This is a type of fat called visceral fat. What you see more on Caucasians is that there's more what's called subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous means fat that is beneath the skin. So the fat that you can pinch and jiggle, that's subcutaneous. Visceral fat is the fat that's tucked within the abdomen space. So around the kidneys and the liver and the intestines, that is more visceral fat. And that type of fat, if it starts to grow, it will only grow through hypertrophy. So those fat cells just get bigger. No more numbers. The number stays the same, but the fat cells get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they become more and more insulin resistant. Now, as those fat cells get bigger and bigger, they start actually spreading their fat into an organ that is right next to them, which is the liver. And so there's more liver fat too. So if you compare the Caucasian body to the East Asian body, if you have two good friends, a white guy and the East Asian guy, and they both gain 10 kilos of fat, the white guy has all the fat that's just big and chubby and it's drooping. The East Asian guy, his is more tucked in, so you don't see it as much, but the Caucasian guy is just chubby and he doesn't look very good in his Speedo anymore. The East Asian, his friend, his buddy, he has prediabetes, fatty liver disease, high blood pressure, all of those problems that I showed you about insulin resistance start to come up now. That's why this matters so much. Now, just so you don't think I'm making it up, there are so many studies. So this study that just continue to document that when you start to compare across ethnicities, East Asian bodies, and also South Asian. I know another high population in Singapore is the Indian South Asian. Exact same, in fact, even worse than in East Asian. I framed this talk to kind of touch on the majority population. So very, very important to understand the differences in how different ethnicities store fat. Okay, so in the time we have left, we're going to go over two big questions. What makes the body start to store more fat? Why is the body storing fat? It's more complicated than you think. It's not just calories in, calories out. People love to say that. It's not so simple. But then, once you understand what makes the body store more fat, we'll talk about how to help it store less fat. And then we start to correct the metabolic problems. Okay, so first question, what makes fat grow? There are two signals that have to happen. One, the hormone insulin must be elevated. And second, there must be sufficient calories or energy that is being consumed. Now, what do these have to do with each other? Well, a fat cell doesn't know what to do with energy. For example, back at my laboratory at my university, right now, maybe not at this exact moment, but in my lab, we have an incubator, like a small little oven that keeps it really warm and moist, humid. We have little petri dishes, little plastic dishes growing fat cells right now. And the fat cells, we will put them in the dish and then give them lots of sugar and fat. And if we look at them under a microscope day after day, they don't change at all. Why aren't they getting big? Because they don't know what to do yet. Every cell in the body needs to be told what to do. They're like a naughty little child. They won't just do what they're supposed to. The parent needs to tell them what to do. And that is what hormones do. And when it comes to the fat cell, insulin is what's most important. So those fat cells will not change at all until we add one thing into that little petri dish, insulin. The moment we add insulin, we can look back at those cells 6 hours later and they will be bigger. 6 hours later still, they will be even chubbier than they were before. Now they know what to do. So insulin tells the fat cell what to do. It tells the fat cell to grow. But then if the fat cell says, okay, I'm going to grow, what can I grow with? That's where the energy is important, the calories, what we call calories. But calories alone is insufficient. That doesn't tell you the whole story. There has to be the signal to tell the fat cells to grow. That is insulin. This is so important, and it kind of goes beyond this lecture right now. Everyone only ever talks about the energy or the calories. If there is not elevated insulin, this does not matter at all. Are you familiar with type 1 diabetes? Did you know that there is an eating disorder that is unique to type 1 diabetes, where the person learns they can eat whatever they want, and guess what they need to do to just be as skinny as they want to? They just don't inject their insulin. Now, it's terrible, it can kill them, it's very unhealthy, and yet they learn that if they just keep that insulin in the syringe and don't inject it, they'll be as skinny as they want. They can eat as much as they want and it won't matter. Because if the fat cells aren't being told to store the energy, the body just wastes it. Metabolic rate goes up, they start making ketones and wasting it. Anyway, that's a topic for another time. I just want to impress upon you the importance of the hormone insulin. There is no fat growth unless insulin is elevated, and then insulin tells the fat cells to grow, and then the calories fuel that growth. It gives the fat cell the structure, the substance that it needs to get bigger and bigger. Okay, so what's the problem? Why do we have in every country around the world, regardless of the ethnicity, in Singapore we have so many beautiful ethnicities. Why is everyone getting a little chubbier? In the US, everyone's getting chubbier. In the Middle East, it doesn't matter. Pacific Islands, it doesn't matter. It's because we have one, constant carbohydrate consumption, and two, feasting too frequently. We eat too much, we eat all the time. And if we're not eating something, we're drinking something all the time that has lots of sugar in it. And now, why am I focusing on carbohydrates? Is it because I hate carbohydrates and I'm declaring war? No, it's because carbohydrates are unique. Now that is one macronutrient. Carbohydrates are one of 3 macronutrients. The other macronutrients are fats and proteins. Now why do I focus on carbohydrates? One reason is because globally, most of the calories people eat are carbohydrate. Over 70% of all calories consumed globally come from carbohydrates. That seems a little skewed. It becomes problematic when we look at how the human body responds to these macronutrients. So for example, now this is just so if you've noticed in the corner of some of my images, I have a little what's called PMID. That's the PubMed index number, and you can look up any of these studies and look at the results yourself. So this result right here that I'm going to show you is directly from the paper. I just sort of made it my own pretty version. I know it's funny for a person who looks like me to worry about how things look, but I actually have a very strong sense of wanting things to look good. In fact, it's my wife who obviously doesn't care how things look. So what happens when a human eats pure fat? Nothing happens. No insulin change at all. Insulin just stays low where it was before. What happens when a human eats pure protein? Also very, very low, essentially no response whatsoever. This is things like meat or dairy or eggs, cheese. This is no response to insulin. Now, however, when a person eats pure carbohydrate, this can be rice, it can be bread, it can be juice, drinking juice, it can be sugary soda, whatever. Then there is an enormous insulin response. And insulin will go up 10, 20, 30 times and stay elevated for up to 3 hours. In fact, if a person is insulin resistant, then the hormone insulin isn't able to bring down the blood sugar very well, and it can go up to 4, 5, or 6 hours until insulin comes down. Now, all of this is very problematic because not only what we eat, which is primarily carbohydrate, and the insulin response that follows it, but also how frequently we eat it. Because in Singapore, having lived here, I know it's similar to the US, we eat a big, starchy, sugary breakfast. Then an hour later or so, 90 minutes, 2 hours, we have a little snack. And then we have a lunch, then we have an afternoon snack, then we have dinner, and we have to have a snack before we go to bed. Everyone thinks they do. And so the average individual is spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. We're never giving our bodies enough of a fasting period to allow the insulin to come down and start to help the body be more insulin sensitive and to start to reverse the insulin resistance. Now, to bring all of this back to the fat cell, when you look at it like this, you can start to see the problem, which is we have a lot of insulin coming with a lot of calories, which is the perfect recipe to tell the body to store more fat. So now you know the problem. We store fat because we have lots of insulin all the time, telling the fat cells to grow, and we have lots of calories coming in, fueling that fat cell growth. Now, what can we do about it? What's the solution? This is when you tell your friend, but I have some good news, because you are in a good position to help them. The solution becomes simple, but that does not mean it's easy, right? There's a difference between them. The solution is simple, but anytime you ask someone to start changing habits, it's going to be difficult. And indeed, we'll get into some of the reasons why. But the solution is you need to just turn them down. You need to reduce the insulin, and then the energy will start to come down as well. How can we do that? Well, we're constantly consuming carbs. Now we have to control carbs. We were feasting too frequently. Now we fast frequently. So we start to give our body some break. We're not meant to eat 6 times a day. We don't need to do this. Our ancestors would laugh at us and shame us. We should not have to eat like this. We're not little babies who need something to be eating all the time. Now, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to be your professor and to really teach you something valuable. So there are 2 ways a person could do this, that they could control how much carbs they eat and just take more of a break from eating. drugs and diet. Now, the only drug I want to talk about is a drug called semaglutide. Have you heard of this? You may know it in the name of Ozempic or Wegovy. Does that sound more familiar? Have you heard that? Is that becoming more common here in Singapore and Malaysia? Yeah, they have become, I've never seen anything like it. As long as I've been a scientist for about 20 years, I've never seen a drug go from total obscurity to being one of the most popular drugs on the planet, but even more unique, people brag about being on it. No one brags about being on a blood pressure medication. No one brags about being on an erectile dysfunction medication, right? But they brag about being on a weight loss medication. Maybe in the US it's a little different than here, but in the US, Elon Musk brags about it. The Kardashians, as horrible as they are, they brag about being on weight loss drugs. I promise we're a wonderful country. Don't let them determine what you think about the US. So let's talk a little bit about semaglutide, because I suspect either you've been on it or you have a friend or family member who's been on it. And it is important to appreciate the consequences that people don't talk about. All people talk about is the weight loss. Yes, there's weight loss, but it comes at a cost that I think is important to know. Now, I'm not your physician, I'm not your clinician, so I'm not giving anyone any medical advice, right? I'm just your friendly neighborhood scientist. Okay. So what does GLP-1 do? Not long ago at my university, in my hormone class, endocrinology, which I teach this semester, we were teaching about gut hormones, the hormones that come from the intestines, and there are many of them. GLP-1 is now the most famous, but when I started teaching that class 15 years ago, it was not the most famous. Nobody knew what GLP-1 was. But GLP-1 is the drug target that semaglutide is mimicking or kind of turning on, if you will. Now, what does it do? Well, GLP-1 actually does a lot as a hormone, but there are two effects that are the most famous. The first one is that it slows the stomach, the intestines. So when we eat food, normally we eat something, it stays in our stomach for 4 to 5 hours, and then it continues on through the small and then large intestine. When GLP-1 goes up, it will slow that down. Well, maybe the food will take a little longer to leave, and then it makes you just feel full for longer because you have something in your tummy, and you have some bulk there. But also complementing that effect is that GLP-1 will go right to the brain and tell the brain, we don't need to eat, you're full. It will activate the satiety centers of the brain. And so the combination of these is very, very good. So GLP-1 is a very favorable hormone, metabolically speaking, because it will help you just eat a little less. And even more so, we'll touch on in a moment. But that will help the insulin and the energy come down. Now, it's no surprise that because of the normal benefits of GLP-1, this has been taken advantage of. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but now there are these drugs that will turn GLP-1 up to an 11 out of 10. It's going way beyond what the body could normally do on its own. For the sake of time, I decided to cut this out just to have time to talk about other things. But there are very real consequences on the stomach. When you turn GLP-1 up that high, now people have the stomach going so slow that food will stay in the stomach for up to 24 hours. And that is causing people to experience what they jokingly refer to as Ozempic burps, because the food is staying there for so long that it's starting to fester, and it's making noxious fumes come up, and they're burping these stinky burps because the food isn't moving like it's supposed to move. At the same time, a paper was just published not long ago that found that in all of the weight that someone's losing, 40% of it, 40% is coming from fat-free mass. In other words, for every 10 kilos a person was losing as they step on the scale and they are so pleased with themselves, 6 kilos is coming from fat, 4 kilos is coming from other stuff, like muscle and bone. That's not good. We don't want to lose that. Especially because what happens when the person gets off? One of those is going to come back very quickly. One of them may never come back. Okay, now, one of the main reasons people take the drug is to help control cravings. That is the main effect. People in the US, there's a popular phrase called the food noise. The food noise is gone. Do people say that here? Probably not as much. But it's this idea that you're in your home, the children are in bed, you finally clean the home. CK and I were joking about how both in our homes, we're the cleaners. I'm the helper who cleans the house every night because my wife doesn't mind. If things are a little cluttered, she's okay with it. I'm not okay with it. And so we tuck the babies in. They're not babies, 18, 14, 12. They all go to bed and then daddy cleans for 30 minutes. And then I want to sit down and relax. But of course, the moment I sit down and want to relax, then I start to think, I need some ice cream. or I need some cereal in a bowl, some sugary cereal. That's the food noise. But these drugs, when you turn GLP-1 up that high, it's gone. That you don't feel like that anymore. Now, so let's look at what happens. If this is the main reason people experience success on the drugs, and it is, it's because their cravings go away. Let's look at what happens. This paper was published not very long ago. Here's the title. Here's the PubMed ID, so you can look it up and share it with your friends. They gave these people a questionnaire over 2 years that they were documenting. This is just an example. There was more questions than this. But how much do you crave chocolate? How much do you want fruit juice, which is not good? Fruit juice is not good. Do not drink fruit juice. Now, what happened to their sweet cravings? Here's how they rated it. If you see a score, 0 is where they started. That's the average point where they started. If you see that the dot has moved this way, that means the sweet cravings were less, so it was better. Now let's look at what happened when they were on the drug for about 6 months. That's a good change. So they were having a much better time controlling their sweet cravings. What about 1 year? That's still very good. It's still significant, statistically significant, absolutely suggesting that they were still controlling their cravings. Now, what about at 2 years? The magic was gone. At 2 years on the drug, they found that their sweet cravings had gone right back to normal. There was no longer any benefit. This is an absolute fundamental biological principle. Whenever you are stimulating something too much, the body starts to become deaf or resistant to the signal. Earlier I mentioned talking about fast insulin resistance and slow insulin resistance. The slow insulin resistance I presented from the perspective of the growing fat cell, but also just too much insulin alone can cause insulin resistance. We're seeing another version of this, where too much GLP-1 from the drug can create a resistance to the GLP-1. And this is when some people start to take more dose and they can die from it, because then it literally will paralyze their stomach. It will paralyze their intestines. It slows down so much that it stops. But this is why they do it, because the food noise starts to talk to them again. Okay, now, all of this is part of why in the US and in the UK, another paper was published that found almost identical results. 70% of people who get on these drugs get off of them in 2 years. They get sick of feeling sick because they just are always a little nauseous. Also, I didn't show this, I took it out, but now I'm talking about it anyway. They also found that the risk of suicidal behavior doubled. The risk of major depression tripled. And so as much as we say that their cravings went down for sweet things, maybe their cravings for life also starts to go down. So these are very, very powerful drugs that need to be used very, very carefully. Okay, now, let's imagine you have a friend who is feeling sick. They think, I have to get off these drugs. I'm feeling weaker because I'm losing muscle. I don't like feeling like this. There is a story of a woman in the US who, there are, unfortunately, I see this as a professor, where young girls are tempted to have an eating disorder. Some young, healthy girls who are perfectly lean are taking these drugs to help them not feel hungry, to make it easier to not eat, to have anorexia. But they found this one girl was, I think, 26 years old. She went and got a bone scan, and she already has enough bone loss that she has the bones of a 60-year-old.
Wow.
Yes, not good. These are very, very powerful drugs. And so maybe you'll have a friend who says, I want to get off them. Okay, you say, let's talk about a way to get off. That's one way to look at maybe the rest of this conversation. But let's still talk, as we talk about diet, let me just come back to GLP-1 for a moment, because GLP-1 is powerful. And it is something people are interested in because they hear about Ozempic and Wegovy. The body has its own natural way to stimulate GLP-1. Fiber will stimulate GLP-1. So too will proteins and fats. Those foods that people eat will naturally increase GLP-1. But also then, what about an extra boost? What can you do perhaps? How does the body respond to the products of the Feel Great system? Let me teach you a little bit about that. Okay, so first of all, within Unicity, there are a myriad molecules. Some of them are very relevant to GLP-1, including chlorogenic acid and ferulic acid. My lab, just last year, here's the PubMed ID, so this is data from my own lab, published at BYU. We found that yerba mate increased GLP-1 by about 50%. That's from the control to the yerba mate group. This was a different gut hormone that didn't change, but GLP-1 did substantially. Now, we just published another paper it was about 1 month ago, so very, very recent. And we wanted, here's the title of it, we wanted to better understand how does ferulic acid act as a stimulant to increase the body's own production? How does it work to make the body make more of its own GLP-1? And we found that ferulic acid directly had only a very modest effect. 1 would be normal, so average. It only went up about 15%. So that couldn't explain the big effect that we'd seen earlier. But then we found that the body, when we take in ferulic acid, like from yerba mate, the microbiome, the bacteria in our stomach or intestines, will convert ferulic acid into dihydroferulic acid. And dihydroferulic acid had a huge effect at stimulating the cells of the intestine to make more GLP-1. So this was the very new finding that we published in that report. And of course, we used yerba mate in the study completely. So that's one new thing to talk about with regards to the Feel Great system and GLP-1. Another is that soluble fibers, and you have the best source of soluble fibers, when someone consumes fiber, the soluble fibers like in BioSlife S, it will go through the intestines and stimulate the L cells of the small intestine right after the stomach to release more GLP-1 into the body. Now remember, this is so helpful, the combination of these two effects, because if GLP-1 goes up, it helps the brain say, hey, I'm not very hungry. But importantly, it's not going to the crazy levels that you see on the drug. It's boosting them up just more than normal. But that's just a little more advantage, a little more help that a person can have to control carbs and just fast a little more frequently. Okay, now let's talk about these two concepts in a little more detail. With control carbs, your friend may ask you, well, how can I control carbs? You could say, well, one way to do this is to focus on fiber. Now, what is the role of fiber? When you eat carbohydrate, without fiber, you could get an insulin response like this. But when you add more fiber to the carbohydrate, it will push down the glucose and the insulin response considerably. Importantly, this is one of the reasons why when I talk about control carbohydrates, I think it's so important to talk about the importance of eating whole fruits and vegetables. Very good, enjoy them, but don't drink them, because when we drink them as a juice, what have we stripped away? The fiber. All we've left is the sugar from the fruit, which when you get it with the fiber is much less harmful on the body. God intended the juice to come with the fiber. Who are we to pull them apart? In our hubris, we think we know more than creation or evolution. Invoke whatever authority you'd like. But they are supposed to come together. So my view, then, when you talk to your friend about focus on fiber, my advice is pick whichever meal or two is the one where you eat the most carbs. That makes BIOS Life S the most important. Now, interestingly, there's another molecule that you can teach your friend about that can have a similar effect to fiber, which is a molecule called chlorogenic acid. This paper had two, these are both quotes from this manuscript right here. But what they found is that with consumption of chlorogenic acid in humans, it helped not only lower fasting glucose, like when you wake up in the morning, they would just be lower, but if you consume chlorogenic acid with carbohydrate, it once again brought down the insulin and the glucose response. It made the body clear it faster. And so your friend will say, well, how can I get chlorogenic acid? And you say, I have a good source for you, because that's one of the molecules enriched in Unicity. So another benefit of the chlorogenic acid, in addition to stimulating GLP-1, it also helps improve the glucose and insulin response to dietary carbohydrate. Now, what about frequently fasting? When you talk to your friend about the importance of fasting, they're going to say, oh, but fasting is so hard. I don't want to do this. How can I do it better? And you follow up with your friend because you care about them. You say, hey, you were going to try to fast today. How did it go? Oh, I failed. I couldn't do it. I quit. Well, then you teach your friend, you know what? There are some important points about fasting, two in particular. You have to learn how to control cravings and control hunger. They're not the same thing, although they're very similar. But cravings is something distinct from hunger. But thankfully, the solution can actually be the same. Now, when we talk about cravings, I'm sort of repeating myself a little bit. Which macronutrient do humans crave? Do you ever sit around on a Friday night, turning on a movie after the house is clean and you can finally relax, and you think, I want to eat a stick of butter? No. Or, I can't wait to drink a cup of olive oil? No. No one craves fat. It doesn't happen. There's no evidence of humans having an addiction for fat. What about protein? Is anyone thinking, oh, I want to have a scoop of whey protein. I'm going to snort it like a drug. No. No one is craving pure protein. It doesn't happen. There's no such thing. Carbohydrates? Oh, of course. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. You want something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy, and the one thing it will have in common is it's going to have a lot of carbohydrates. Maybe also some fat, but it's not the fat. The fat just makes the carbs even better. But it's the carbs that you're craving. And indeed, this is a very well-established area of research. All of the neurobiology of food addiction comes back to carbs every time. The finger points at carbs. So your friend will say, I'm having such a hard time. Then you say, did you know that when you taste something bitter in your mouth, it actually can tell your brain that you don't need the sweet, that you don't need the sweetness, the sweet foods, the sweet drink. And so the bitter tastants, that's what some of these molecules are called, theobromine and saponins, enriched in Unicity. Have you ever noticed a bit of a bitter taste to Unicity? Yeah. Don't apologize for it. In fact, when we were talking about when Unicity was first announced at the GLIC in Singapore in 2016, I remember that was the very first GLIC I ever attended. Did you know that? The very first one ever. And I heard them talking about some distributors were talking about, oh, but it's so bitter. But how can we help mask that flavor? And I said, I was thinking, I don't think I said it, but I was thinking, no, that's not bad. It's good. Emphasize it, sell it as a point, because when we taste bitter, the brain will say, oh, okay, I don't need sweet. And so sometimes what I've heard of people doing in the evening, I'm a terrible sleeper, so I don't drink too much. I've been drinking a little more Unicity since I've been in Singapore because of the time change. But they may just swish it in their mouth. You don't have to drink a whole packet in the evening to control the craving. Just swish it in your mouth or sip on it. Very, very little. You can still sleep fine. And you don't, as a tangent, let me step outside this topic for just 1 second. I stepped outside of it. You do not, of all the times of the day, to not spike your blood sugar levels, it's evening when you go to bed. When you go to bed in a hyperglycemic state, you activate something called your sympathetic nervous system. And so your heart starts beating harder and faster. You're hot. And in Singapore, you're already hot. I'm sweating I haven't stopped sweating in 6 days since I landed at Changi. So you go to bed and you're wondering, why am I so anxious? What am I worried about? You're not worried about anything. You just made your body start to panic because you went to bed at hyperglycemic. So of all the times to not spike your blood sugar, it's when you're getting ready for bed. It is the worst. It is a guarantee you're not going to sleep well. Okay, now, what else about these molecules? These same molecules, theobromine and saponins, when you taste something bitter, you also control hunger, but that is separate because cravings, you can be full and still be craving something, right? But hunger is you just want to eat more of something. Well, the bitter tastings also help control appetite. What's so interesting about this study is that they documented how we not only taste something bitter in our mouth, but we also have bitter taste receptors in our intestines. Now, we're not thinking, that's bitter as it moves through my duodenum and my jejunum and my ileum. No, we don't sense it like that. But the intestines are sensing it. And that's sending the signal to the brain to say we don't need to eat. Appetite is down. So these are some ways. Now also, there's one last thing I want to mention about this, which is short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are molecules that humans do not get very much of. We don't eat them. We usually get them by making them in our intestines. When we eat fiber, the fiber will come into our intestines. We don't metabolize fiber as humans. They give us no energy. But our bacteria can eat that fiber. And indeed, it's good food for them. When they eat fiber, they release short-chain fats. And then these short-chain fats, which cannot be stored, we cannot store them. Don't worry about them making our fat cells big. They just get burned immediately. But when they are getting burned, it sends another signal to the brain, we don't need to eat. So here's another mechanism to help control hunger. Now, as I start to wrap up, how might this look? I would say, first of all, there's no wrong way to use the Feel Great system products. It's however a person feels best using them. I would just suggest there might be one way. So let's imagine your friend who is struggling with high blood pressure and they've been told they have fatty liver. We went to, just this morning, we took a Grab taxi down to go to Sentosa, to go to Universal Studios, to indulge and spoil the little Bikmans. And to bankrupt Daddy even more. And we were in the taxi, and the driver was so pleasant. He was so nice. His name was Kenneth. I took a selfie. I was going to put a picture, but I didn't. He was just delightful. And I'm telling him about how much we love Singapore, how our daughter Lizzie or Elizabeth was born in Singapore, and we love coming back, and that I had been at Duke NUS and giving a talk at NUS. And then I just mentioned how I study diabetes. And he said, well, I'm pre-diabetic. And you know what? You'd never know, because he does not look chubby. You know what I mean? He was just almost the same size as me, and he's pre-diabetic. And I asked him, well, how had you been eating? Here he is. And he said he would drink sugary soda all day. And so he wakes up, he eats a sugary breakfast, or starchy, like toast. One of my kids' favorite treats. Don't think I'm a bad father. It's Kaya butter toast. They love it. And I think, oh, I love you. You can have some. But at the same time, I'm thinking, oh, your blood sugar is going so high right now. I love you. I'm being a good daddy, but a bad daddy at the same time. But it's just like this all day long. And so what would I tell Kenneth? I would say, come to the Unicity office. At minimum, get rid of all the snacking. And so look at these as a 4-hour mini fast. Breakfast, mini fast. Lunch, mini fast. Supper, then you're done. Now, how can it be a little easier? That's where I think you really can start to say, this is how I personally do it. So if you want to look like a wrinkled, almost 50-year-old freckled bald man, you could do this too. But this is how it works for me. Although sometimes I will switch and have a balance, it depends. I won't ever take a Unimate at dinner because I don't sleep very well anyway, and I don't want more of a stimulant. But this balance, where if a person, although I don't eat breakfast, I just take a hot Unicity. But anyway, you could do it any way you want. I'm just suggesting this could be one way. And then as you're teaching your friend about these principles, I just encourage you to remind them it's what's in the product that matters most. And I do think there's value in learning that there is these effects of theobromine and saponins. They are the bitter tastants that can help the brain say, oh, I don't need the sugar, or I don't need to eat right now. It's the ferulic acid and the chlorogenic acid, which will stimulate more GLP-1. And then same with GLP-1 and the short chain fats stimulating a greater sense of appetite or controlling the appetite better. All of these things start to kind of cook and boil together to create something that is a bit of metabolic magic. And with that, I thank you so much for being my attentive students, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.